A surgeon who had just saved the life of a United States senator was stopped by police outside the very hospital where the operation had taken place. His crime, in the eyes of the officer who approached him, was nothing more than a hooded sweatshirt, an aging sedan, and a refusal to step away from a cooler holding a donor heart. Within minutes he was on his knees in the rain, hands cuffed behind his back, while a small crowd gathered under umbrellas to watch. When the police chief arrived to confirm the arrest, the surgeon said only 2 words. The chief's face went pale, and the entire scene fell into a silence that nobody there would ever forget. The rain that autumn evening was thin and cold, the kind that never quite became a storm, but never let up either, settling over the city in a gray mist that blurred every streetlight into a soft halo. Inside the hospital, machines beeped in steady rhythms. Nurses moved between rooms with practiced urgency, and somewhere beneath all of it, a man who had spent the better part of his life learning how to hold a human heart in his own 2 hands was finishing the hardest shift of his week. Nobody in that building doubted his skill. Outside its walls, in the space of a few short minutes, none of that would matter at all. Marcus Bennett walked out of operating room 4 a little after 9 in the evening, his scrubs soaked through at the collar, his hands trembling from 10 straight hours of concentration. Behind him, a surgical team was still finishing the final checks on a patient whose heart had stopped twice on the table before Marcus brought it back both times. A junior resident told him quietly that no one else in the hospital could have closed that chest and walked away smiling, and Marcus only shrugged, because to him, it was simply the job he had trained half his life to do. Marcus had grown up in a small apartment above a laundromat, the son of a nurse's aide who worked double shifts to keep the lights on, and he had never forgotten what it felt like to watch his mother come home exhausted and still find the energy to check on a neighbor's sick child before dinner. That memory had followed him through medical school, through residency, through every long night since, shaping a man who measured his worth, not by the letters after his name, but by the steadiness of his hands when it mattered most. Colleagues sometimes joked that he could have built a private practice worth millions by now, and Marcus always answered the same way, that a heart did not beat any differently depending on who was paying for it. The hospital administrator offered him the use of a company car that evening, a black town car with tinted windows and a driver waiting at the curb, the kind of vehicle reserved for surgeons whose names appeared in donor newsletters. Marcus declined, the way he always declined, and walked instead toward the far corner of the parking garage where his own car waited under a flickering light. It was a sedan more than 20 years old, the paint faded to a dull gray, one hubcap missing since a winter 3 years earlier that he had never gotten around to replacing. He pulled a gray hooded sweatshirt over his scrubs because the autumn air outside had turned sharp and cold, and because comfort, after 10 hours on his feet, mattered more to him than appearances. In his other hand, he carried a rigid medical cooler, its surface lined with sensors and a small digital display that blinked a steady green. Inside it rested a segment of donor heart tissue, flown in that morning from another state, needed at a transplant facility across town before it lost viability. A courier service had fallen through at the last minute, and Marcus, without hesitation, had volunteered to drive it himself. The clock on his dashboard read 8:51 when he pulled out of the garage, and the transplant team on the other side of the city had made it clear that the tissue needed to arrive within 35 minutes or the entire procedure would have to be postponed. Rain had begun to fall in a fine mist, blurring the streetlights into soft halos, and Marcus drove carefully, the cooler belted into the passenger seat like a second passenger who mattered more than he did. He glanced at the clock again, calculating the shortest route, thinking only of the patient waiting on the other end. He never saw the second set of headlights fall in behind him until the flash of red and blue lit up his rearview mirror, painting the inside of the old sedan in alternating colors. Marcus felt his pulse tighten in his chest, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden awareness that every second now counted twice as much. He signaled, pulled to the curb along the hospital's outer perimeter road, and reached for the cooler to keep it steady, already rehearsing in his mind the calm explanation he would give. Officer Kyle Mercer approached the driver's side with his flashlight raised before his badge, sweeping the beam across the sedan's cracked windshield and the hooded figure behind the wheel. He rapped twice on the glass and ordered Marcus to step out of the vehicle immediately, his voice carrying the clipped edge of a man who had already decided what kind of night this was going to be. Marcus rolled the window down slowly, keeping both hands visible on the wheel, and explained in an even voice that he was a physician transporting time-sensitive medical tissue under a strict deadline. Kyle's eyes moved past Marcus to the cooler on the passenger seat, its lid sealed with tamper tape, its display blinking with numbers he did not recognize. He asked what was inside it, and when Marcus answered that it contained donor heart tissue destined for a transplant across the city, the officer's expression only hardened further, as though the explanation itself sounded like a lie rehearsed too smoothly. Marcus offered, calmly, to have the officer call the hospital directly, gave him the extension of the transplant coordinator, even offered his own hospital identification badge clipped inside his sweatshirt pocket. Kyle did not reach for the badge, did not radio the hospital, did not so much as glance at the offered proof. Instead, he ordered Marcus out of the car a second time, louder now, and when Marcus hesitated for the span of a single breath, worried about leaving the cooler unattended in the open air, the officer's hand moved to his belt. A young couple walking beneath a nearby awning slowed their steps, one of them lifting a phone to record, sensing before they understood exactly what was happening that something in this stop had gone wrong. Marcus stepped out of the car with his hands raised, the cooler still balanced against the open door, trying one more time to explain the countdown ticking away inside that sealed container. Kyle's partner that night, Officer Lisa Monroe, stood a few feet back, watching the exchange with a stillness that suggested she was reading the situation differently than her partner was. She noticed the surgical scrub pants visible beneath the hooded sweatshirt, noticed the hospital lanyard swinging from Marcus's neck, and felt the first small stone of doubt settle into her stomach. Kyle ordered Marcus to the ground, and when the surgeon asked, still politely, whether he could first set the cooler safely on the hood of the car, the officer read the request as defiance. Within seconds, Marcus was face down on the wet pavement, his cheek pressed against cold asphalt, his hands drawn behind his back and locked into handcuffs while the rain fell steadily onto his neck. The small crowd under the awning had grown to a dozen people now, phones raised, voices murmuring, none of them stepping forward, all of them recording a moment. None of them yet understood. Lisa crouched beside the sedan and looked through the open door at the cooler resting precariously on the passenger seat, its blinking light shifting from a steady green to an amber that pulsed faster with every second. She had worked enough calls involving hospital transports to recognize a temperature warning when she saw one, and a small current of alarm moved through her, though she said nothing yet, waiting to see how her partner would handle what came next. Marcus, cheek still against the pavement, turned his head just enough to see the light change color, and for the first time that night, his calm voice cracked with real urgency. Among the onlookers stood an older man who had once been a patient of Marcus's years earlier, a heart attack survivor who recognized the surgeon's voice before he ever saw his face clearly through the rain. He pushed forward, telling anyone who would listen that the man on the ground had personally stitched his chest back together after a collapse in a grocery store parking lot, that he owed his life, quite literally, to those same hands now pinned uselessly behind his back. His words did little to move Kyle, whose focus remained fixed on procedure rather than on the growing unease rippling through the crowd, but they planted something in Lisa that would not let her look away. The footage began circulating within the hour, first among the small group who had filmed it live, then spreading outward through message threads and group chats until strangers across the city were watching a black surgeon face down in handcuffs outside the hospital where he worked. Opinions split instantly and violently, one side insisting the officer had simply been doing his job under uncertain circumstances, the other side pointing to the scrub pants, the hospital badge, the calm and cooperative tone in Marcus's voice throughout the entire recording. Kyle, when questioned by a passing supervisor over the radio, stated flatly that he had followed procedure and that the man in custody had matched the profile of a suspicious individual reported near the parking structure earlier that evening. Marcus remained silent on the ground, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that resistance now, physical or verbal, would only be used against him later. Lisa knelt again near the open car door, this time actually lifting the cooler's tamper tape to read the printed label beneath it. A hospital logo, a transplant coordinator's name, a barcode matching a formal transport authorization. She held the label up toward Kyle, asking quietly whether they should verify this before things went any further. And for a moment her partner's certainty flickered, though he quickly waved the paperwork away, insisting the tape could have been forged. No one moved to open the cooler itself. Out of some instinctive fear of tampering with medical equipment, none of them understood. And so it sat there on the wet car seat, its warning light blinking faster and faster, while the debate around it continued, as though the object itself were invisible. Marcus, still restrained, called out once more that the hospital transplant line needed to be contacted immediately, that every additional minute reduced the odds of a successful surgery for a patient he had never even met. Kyle told him to stay quiet, and reached instead for his radio, though what came through it in the following moments would do nothing to slow the situation already spiraling out of his control. Dispatch tried 3 separate times to reach the responding units at that location, relaying an urgent callback from the hospital's transplant department asking for immediate confirmation of the courier's status. Kyle heard the first call crackle through his radio, and certain he was already in control of a dangerous situation, reached down and turned the volume low enough to mute it, choosing instead to finish processing the man he had decided was guilty of something. Lisa heard it too, and this time she did not stay quiet, telling her partner directly that the hospital was calling about exactly the cooler, sitting in the back seat of the car they had stopped. The crowd along the sidewalk had swelled further, phones held high, a murmur rising as more people arrived from a nearby bus stop and slowed to watch a man in surgical scrubs kneeling in restraints beside a hospital vehicle. Somewhere in that crowd, a nurse coming off her own shift recognized Marcus immediately, gasped audibly, and began telling the strangers around her exactly who he was and what he had likely just finished doing inside those hospital walls. Word moved through the gathering crowd like a current, transforming confusion into outrage in the space of a few sentences, though it did nothing yet to change the reality of a man still kneeling in the rain with his hands locked behind him. It was the sound of tires against wet pavement, sharp and sudden, that finally broke the standoff as a dark SUV swung around the corner and braked hard at the edge of the scene. The driver's door opened before the vehicle had fully stopped, and a woman stepped out, still wearing a surgical blouse, streaked with drying blood along one sleeve, her badge swinging from a lanyard identical to the one clipped to Marcus's sweatshirt. She moved through the crowd without hesitation, without looking at the phones recording her, focused entirely on the kneeling man and the officer standing over him, with one hand still resting on his belt. Her voice cut through the murmur of the crowd with an authority that made even Kyle take an involuntary step backward, demanding that the handcuffs be removed immediately and that someone tell her exactly what justified detaining a physician on hospital property. Kyle asked her, with the same suspicion he had shown Marcus, who exactly she believed she was to be giving him orders on his own scene. She answered without raising her voice further, stating plainly that she was the head of emergency medicine at the hospital behind them, and that the man on the ground worked directly under her authority in matters concerning organ transport. Kyle still did not move to release the cuffs, some stubborn part of him unwilling to admit in front of a gathered crowd that the last several minutes might have been built on a mistake. Lisa, however, had already begun reaching for her own key, sensing that whatever authority this woman carried was not something to be tested any further. It was in that suspended moment, with the rain falling steadily and dozens of strangers watching in near silence, that Marcus lifted his head from the pavement and found the woman's eyes across the small distance between them. He said only 2 words, quiet but unmistakably clear, even over the murmur of the crowd, words that carried more meaning in that moment than any explanation, any badge, any paperwork could have offered. He said, simply, "My wife." The words landed on the scene like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward through the crowd, through Lisa's stunned expression, through Kyle's suddenly frozen posture, and finally through the man who had just arrived at the edge of the gathering, stepping out of his own vehicle, with his chief's badge catching the light from a passing patrol car. Chief Daniel Harrison had come personally because a call about an arrest outside the hospital involving a possible medical emergency had been flagged as high priority, the kind of situation that required a senior officer's presence before it grew into something the department could not control. He crossed the wet pavement with long, purposeful strides, already prepared to smooth over whatever tension his officers had created, already rehearsing the calm authority he had carried through 3 decades on the force. What he was not prepared for was the sight of his own daughter standing over a man in handcuffs, her surgical blouse still marked with the blood of the patient she had just helped save. The words "my wife" reached him a half-second before his eyes fully registered who was speaking them, and for a moment Chief Harrison simply stood still in the rain, his mouth slightly open, his mind refusing to assemble what his eyes were showing him. Emily Harrison had kept her father's surname even after her marriage years earlier, a quiet decision she had made deliberately to avoid even the faintest suggestion of favoritism inside a hospital system, where her father's name still carried weight among certain board members. She had told very few people about the marriage at all, wanting her career built entirely on her own competence, never imagining that her carefully guarded privacy would collide with her father's badge on a rain-soaked street outside her own emergency department. Chief Harrison's gaze moved slowly from his daughter to the man kneeling in cuffs at her feet, a man he now understood he had met exactly twice before, both times at quiet family dinners, where introductions had been kept deliberately vague, both times, without ever learning the man's full name or profession. The realization arrived in pieces, each one heavier than the last, that the surgeon his officers had thrown to the ground outside a hospital was the same man who had sat across from him at his own daughter's dinner table, laughing quietly at some story about a difficult patient. For several long seconds, the chief said nothing at all, and the silence stretched across the crowd, until even the strangers holding up their phones seemed to sense that something far larger than an ordinary arrest was unfolding in front of them. 30 years on, the force had taught Daniel Harrison how to read a scene in seconds, how to separate fact from noise, how to keep his voice level even when everything around him was unraveling. None of that training had prepared him for the particular vertigo of watching his own daughter, blood still drying on her sleeve, standing over a man he now understood, shared his family's holidays, his daughter's laughter, a life he had never once been allowed to fully see. He thought, absurdly, of a dinner 2 years earlier, when this same man had passed him a dish of mashed potatoes across a crowded table, and he wondered how he had failed to ask a single meaningful question about who he really was. It was Emily who broke the silence first, her voice steady, despite the tremor beneath it, demanding that the handcuffs be removed from her husband immediately, and that someone explain to her exactly what evidence had justified any of this. Chief Harrison, still visibly shaken, turned to Kyle and asked in a low voice what specific probable cause had led to the detention of a man who was, by every visible indication, a hospital physician engaged in a medical transport. Kyle stammered through an explanation about a suspicious vehicle report and an uncooperative attitude, but the words sounded thinner with every second, especially as Lisa quietly produced the tamper-taped label from the cooler and handed it directly to the chief. While the handcuffs were finally unlocked, the crowd around them had begun to piece together fragments of who Marcus Bennett actually was, and a low wave of recognition moved through the gathering, like a second current beneath the first. Someone in scrubs near the hospital entrance called out his name, and within seconds, a small group of nurses and technicians had gathered at the edge of the scene, several of them visibly emotional at the sight of their most respected surgeon kneeling in the rain. Marcus Bennett had spent nearly 15 years inside that hospital's cardiac unit, and in that time he had personally performed transplant surgeries credited with saving more than 300 lives, a number the hospital's own annual reports repeated with quiet pride. He had been offered positions at some of the most prestigious research hospitals in the country, invitations that came with signing bonuses large enough to buy a house outright, and he had turned down every single one of them without hesitation, choosing instead to remain at the public hospital where he had first trained as a resident. National medical boards had honored him twice with awards recognizing innovation in transplant technique, plaques that hung, largely unnoticed, on a wall outside his office that he rarely stopped to look at himself. He was, by every professional measure available, one of the most accomplished cardiac transplant surgeons in the entire region, a fact that made the sight of him in handcuffs all the more jarring to everyone now watching. The patient who had received his surgery earlier that evening was, as it happened, a sitting state senator whose office had specifically requested Marcus by name after learning of his transplant success rate, a detail that would only become public later, but which added an additional layer of gravity to everything unfolding on the street. The cooler resting in the back of his car, the one that had triggered the entire confrontation, held a segment of donor heart tissue, valued at several $1 million in research and preservation costs, intended for a second transplant procedure scheduled to begin within the hour. As Chief Harrison finally lifted the cooler carefully from the seat, his hands noticeably unsteady, the warning display blinked its amber light one final time before shifting into a solid, unmistakable red. Lisa moved quickly, activating the small camera clipped to her uniform and calling out for someone to retrieve a portable cooling unit from inside the hospital immediately, her voice carrying an urgency that finally seemed to register with everyone standing nearby. A technician sprinted from the emergency entrance with a replacement container, and within a tense 2 minutes the tissue had been transferred, stabilized, and rushed inside under Emily's direct supervision, her medical training taking over, even as her personal work. Marcus, finally free of the cuffs, rubbed his wrists once but made no move to follow the tissue inside, his attention instead fixed on the small device clipped to Lisa's uniform, the one that had been recording the entire encounter from the very first moment. Lisa offered to play the footage back immediately, and Chief Harrison nodded once, his jaw tight, already dreading exactly what the recording would show him about his own department. The footage confirmed everything Marcus had said from the very beginning. His calm explanation of the medical transport, his repeated offers of identification, his request that the hospital simply be contacted to verify his story before anything escalated further. It showed, in equally unmistakable detail, Kyle's refusal to check the badge, his decision to mute the incoming radio calls from dispatch, and his choice to physically restrain a cooperative man rather than take 30 seconds to confirm a claim that could have been verified with a single phone call. Kyle stood at the edge of the gathering with his arms crossed, insisting the footage would show he had acted within department guidelines, that a nervous man refusing at first to leave his vehicle was reasonable grounds for caution given the late hour and the empty parking structure nearby. But as the crowd around him watched portions of the footage replayed on a nearby phone, passed hand to hand among the nurses and bystanders who had gathered, the murmurs shifted from confusion into something sharper, closer to anger, directed now squarely at the officer rather than at the man he had detained. Chief Harrison, watching his own department's credibility unravel in real time on a public street, made a decision he would later describe as the easiest and hardest of his entire career, ordering an internal investigation to begin that same night before either officer left the scene. Marcus, for his part, showed no interest in confrontation, no desire to raise his voice at Kyle or demand an apology from the chief standing before him, his mind already moving past the humiliation of the last 20 minutes, toward the only question that actually mattered to him. He asked Emily directly whether there was still time to complete the second transplant procedure, his voice carrying the same steady focus it had carried in the operating room, hours earlier, as though the handcuffs and the rain and the crowd had simply been an inconvenient detour. Emily checked the time on her phone, did a quick calculation in her head, and told him they had perhaps 20 minutes if they moved immediately, and Marcus was already walking toward the hospital entrance before she finished the sentence. Nurses parted to let him through, several reaching out to touch his shoulder briefly as he passed, a wordless gesture of solidarity that meant more to him in that moment than any spoken apology could have. Emily fell into step beside him, stripping off her damaged blouse as she walked and calling ahead to have a fresh set of scrubs waiting, her surgical team already assembling by the time the two of them reached the elevator. Behind them, Chief Harrison stood in the rain beside his own patrol car, watching his daughter, and the man he now understood to be his son-in-law, disappear through the sliding glass doors, the weight of everything he had just witnessed settling heavily across his shoulders. Inside Operating Room 2, The second transplant proceeded with a precision that gave no outward sign of the chaos that had preceded it. Marcus's hands as steady over the new patient's chest as they had been 10 hours earlier over the senator's. Emily stood at his side throughout, her presence, a quiet anchor, neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both clearly relied upon, the two of them moving through the procedure with the practiced rhythm of a partnership built over years rather than months. When the final monitor confirmed a strong and steady heartbeat nearly 2 hours later, Marcus allowed himself, for the first time since kneeling on the wet pavement outside, to exhale fully and let his shoulders drop. By the time he stepped out of the operating room, the footage from the arrest had already begun, spreading well beyond the small crowd that had witnessed it in person. Picked up first by a local news affiliate whose camera crew had arrived, just as the ambulance carrying the replacement cooler pulled away. Reporters gathered near the hospital's main entrance within the hour, their questions directed at anyone in scrubs willing to speak. And it did not take long before the full story, cooler and all, moved from a local curiosity into a matter of citywide attention. Photographs of Marcus kneeling in handcuffs beside his aging sedan appeared alongside photographs from years earlier of him receiving his National Transplant Award. The jarring contrast between the two images, doing more to fuel public outrage than any written article could have managed alone. Local anchors read his biography on air that same night, the 300 lives credited to his hands, and viewers who had never met him found themselves oddly moved by the story of a man they had only just learned existed. Letters began arriving at the hospital within days, some from former patients thanking him again for surgeries performed years earlier, others from strangers, simply wanting him to know they were sorry for what had happened, each one a small, quiet counterweight to the humiliation of that rainy evening. Marcus read every letter Emily brought home to him, never responding publicly to any of them, keeping instead a small stack in the drawer of his nightstand. Evidence, he told her once, that decency still outnumbered its opposite, even on the worst of nights. The hospital's security office released its own exterior footage the following morning, at the request of Chief Harrison himself, unedited and complete, showing the entire encounter from the moment the patrol car's lights first appeared behind Marcus's sedan. Viewers watched the full 18 minutes without commentary, watched Marcus offer his badge 3 separate times, watched Kyle wave it away, watched the cooler's warning light shift from green to amber to red, while the argument over jurisdiction continued around it. Within the hospital community and far beyond it, Marcus was held up as a symbol of quiet dignity under pressure, his calm insistence on procedure and patience standing in stark contrast to everything that had been done to him. Kyle Mercer was placed on administrative leave within 48 hours, and the internal investigation Chief Harrison had ordered on the street that same night soon widened into something far larger than a single incident. Investigators combing through years of prior complaints against the officer uncovered a pattern of similar stops, disproportionately involving black residents in professional attire, several of which had been quietly settled or dismissed without any real scrutiny at the time. Chief Harrison, reviewing those files personally over the following days, found himself confronting an uncomfortable truth about how much his own department had allowed to slip past unexamined, buried under routine paperwork, and the presumption that his officers always acted in good faith. One file in particular stopped him cold, a complaint filed nearly 2 years earlier by a schoolteacher who had been stopped outside his own apartment building for carrying a stack of graded exams that an officer insisted looked suspicious in the dark. The complaint had been closed within a week, marked resolved with no further action, the teacher's account dismissed in favor of the officer's version of events without a single follow-up interview conducted. Reading it now, alongside 3 similar reports spanning the better part of 2 years, Chief Harrison understood that the failure on that rainy street had not been an isolated lapse in judgment, but the visible edge of something his department had been quietly permitting for far longer than he wanted to admit. He called a press conference within the week, standing before a bank of cameras outside the same hospital where the arrest had taken place, and offered an apology that avoided the careful, lawyerly language such statements often relied upon. He named Marcus directly, acknowledged the specific failures of the officer involved, and admitted plainly that his department had allowed bias to override basic verification procedures that should have ended the encounter within its first 2 minutes. Standing a short distance away, Marcus listened without visible satisfaction or lingering anger, his attention drawn instead to Emily beside him, her hand resting lightly against his arm throughout the entire statement. Mayor Robert Collins, watching the growing coverage with concern for the city's reputation, but also, by most accounts, genuine alarm at what the footage revealed, reached out personally to invite Marcus to speak at a public forum the following week. Marcus considered the invitation carefully before accepting, telling Emily privately that he had no interest in becoming a symbol of outrage, that if he was going to stand before cameras at all, it would only be to speak about something more useful than his own anger. Emily told him she trusted whatever he chose to say, and reminded him, gently, that very few people in his position would have handled the entire ordeal with the composure he had managed to hold on to from the very first minute. The public forum filled beyond its capacity, with additional chairs set up along the back wall and dozens more standing near the entrance, drawn by a story that had, over the course of a single week, become something the entire city seemed to be discussing. Marcus stepped up to the microphone without notes, dressed simply, his surgical badge still clipped to his jacket out of habit rather than intention, and looked out at a room full of faces waiting to hear him name the injustice done to him. Instead, he spoke first about the patient whose heart he had held in his hands that same night, about the second patient whose transplant nearly failed to happen at all, and about how close the city had come to losing something far more important than his own dignity because of a few wasted minutes on a rainy street. He did not mention the color of his skin once during the entire address, choosing instead to speak about accountability, about the value of verification over assumption, about how a single phone call could have prevented everything that followed, sparing not only him, but the department itself, the damage that had since spread across the city. He spoke about responsibility, about the weight every person in a position of authority carries, whether that authority comes from a badge or a scalpel, and about how easily that weight can be misused when caution gives way to certainty without evidence. Emily stood quietly near the back of the stage throughout his remarks, watching him with an expression that mixed pride and something closer to relief, as though she had spent the past week half afraid he would let the anger take hold of him after all. She had watched him, in the privacy of their own home that week, sit silently at the kitchen table for long stretches, not brooding exactly, but working through something she recognized as the same discipline he brought into every operating room. He had told her once, early in their marriage, that surgery had taught him patience was not the absence of urgency, but the mastery of it, and she understood now that he had applied that same lesson to his own fury, letting it settle rather than letting it drive. When a reporter near the front row asked him afterward whether he forgave the officer who had detained him, Marcus paused for a long moment before answering that forgiveness was not really his to give, that accountability mattered more, and that the city's job now was to make sure no one else ever had to ask that question again. Chief Harrison, seated in the front row, listened to every word with his hands folded tightly in his lap, and when Marcus finished, he was the first to rise to his feet, offering a nod that carried far more weight than any applause around him. Afterward, standing together near a side exit away from the remaining reporters, the chief thanked Marcus quietly for the restraint he had shown, admitting that he doubted his own composure would have held under the same circumstances. Marcus told him simply that anger would not have gotten the tissue into that operating room any faster, and that the only thing that had mattered to him in that moment was the patient waiting on the other end of the clock. In the weeks that followed, the city announced a formal set of policy changes drawn directly from the investigation into that single night, requiring officers to verify medical identification through direct hospital contact before escalating any stop involving claimed emergency personnel. Additional training was mandated across every precinct, focused specifically on reducing assumption-driven policing and on de-escalation procedures for encounters involving medical transports, professional attire, and unverified suspicion. Kyle Mercer, following the conclusion of the internal investigation, faced formal disciplinary action in line with department policy his case becoming a frequently cited example in the very training sessions now required of every other officer on the force. Marcus returned to his ordinary routine within days, back in scrubs, back in operating rooms, the aging sedan still parked in its usual corner of the garage each morning, its missing hubcap still unreplaced. He never asked for the car to be traded in, never accepted the Blacktown car. The hospital offered him again, out of some misplaced sense of obligation, content instead to keep driving the vehicle that had carried him faithfully for over 2 decades. Emily, for her part, continued leading her emergency department with the same quiet competence she always had, no longer quite as private about her marriage as she once had been, though still fiercely protective of the professional reputation she had built entirely on her own. On a clear morning some weeks later, the two of them left the hospital together after an overnight shift that had run long into the dawn, the sky above the parking structure finally breaking into a pale gold light after days of steady rain. Marcus unlocked the old sedan, held the door for Emily out of habit rather than performance, and pulled out onto the quiet street as the city slowly woke up around them. There had been no dramatic reckoning, no grand display of power reversed, only a slow and steady return of the respect that should never have been taken from him in the first place. Restored not through vengeance, but through the simple, undeniable weight of the truth. As the sedan rolled down the empty avenue, its engine humming its familiar, imperfect rhythm, the morning light caught the faded gray paint and made it, for just a moment, look almost new again. It was not the car that had ever needed to prove anything, and it was not the badge on his jacket or the awards-gathering dust on his office wall either, but the lives he had spent his career saving, one steady hand at a time, long before anyone outside that hospital had ever learned his name. The city moved on around them, buses pulling away from curbs, shops raising their metal gates for the day ahead, and somewhere behind them, a hospital kept running exactly as it always had, quietly, steadily, because people like Marcus Bennett showed up for it every single day, no matter what the world outside chose to see when it looked at him first. Emily reached over and turned on the radio, low, just background noise against the hum of the engine, and neither of them spoke for a while, content in the kind of silence that only exists between two people who trust each other completely. Somewhere behind them, in a precinct office across town, Chief Harrison sat reviewing the final paperwork on the new department policies, signing his name beneath a page that would, from that day forward, require his officers to verify before they ever assumed. He thought of his daughter's voice on that rainy street, steady, even in crisis, and of the 2 words that had changed everything he believed about how carefully a person's life could be measured before it was truly seen. The sedan turned onto the final stretch of road leading toward the small house Marcus and Emily shared, its old engine still humming that same familiar, imperfect rhythm it always had, carrying 2 people who had weathered something neither of them would ever fully forget. There would be other shifts, other emergencies, other mornings like this one, but there would also, from now on, be a small and permanent shift in how the city around them chose to look before it judged. And somewhere in that quiet, ordinary drive home, in the gray light of a city finally clearing after days of rain, the truth settled the way truth usually does, not with fanfare, but simply, steadily, and for good.